a specific item might be involved or might be usable in a weapons of mass destruction program. So I would encourage you to be less dependent on the export control lists and pay more attention to things like the end user. Who are the people who are involved in this transaction? Where are the goods going? What's the stated purpose? Who are involved in proliferation activities. It doesn't actually matter what's on the goods, what on the manifest. It doesn't actually matter if it's goods or materials that can never be used in a nuclear weapons program. If the goods are ultimately going to a designated party or an entity, or if the goods involves a designated party or entity, that's what makes it prohibited. So I hope that makes sense. It's more about the end use and the end user rather than the specific good itself.
Perfect, thanks. So now a question that you might be answering. So if a compliance officer is to freeze an account, if the customer has two accounts, and one which is individual and the other which is joint, is he required to freeze both or just the individual account?
Yes, is the question. Both accounts would need to be frozen. I mean, so I'll caveat this a little bit. Presumably, if it's a joint account, the sanctioned individual will have control over that account, or will have the ability to make transactions to and from that account, and will have access to the funds that is in the joint account. So yes, the requirement is not to make any assets available to the sanctioned entity. So that kind of means that if it's a joint account, that would still be covered, because the co-owner of that joint account could also be said to be under the control of the sanctioned entity or acting on behalf of the sanctioned entity, and you wouldn't be able to separate out those transactions necessarily. So yes, very much both accounts would need to be frozen in that instance.
Thanks, Emil. I think there's one interesting question, and I hope I understand it correctly, but it basically asks if there is a report done on an institution that for alleged PF institution is going to be listed as violating as a violator under PF regulations.
No, that's a really good question. So we do see that certain entities and businesses have been mentioned in news reporting or in the panel of experts reports as being involved in proliferation financing, but the entities and individuals don't end up being designated. So for those purposes, you're actually only looking at the people who are in fact designated. However, if an entity or a person has been mentioned in news reporting as being involved in proliferation financing, or there's a suspicion of proliferation financing involvement, it definitely warrants an investigation, because the likelihood that even if that person is not designated, the likelihood that that person is acting on behalf of or with or is connected to a designated entity is very, very high. So I would say caution is your best friend when it comes to things like that. I'm not saying de-risk anyone who's ever been mentioned in a news reporting related to proliferation financing, but definitely it's worth looking into whether the fact that they've been mentioned might mean that they are connected to or acting on behalf of or have close relations to a designated entity or person.
Perfect. And now we can move into the territory of discussing obfuscation techniques. So it's a question on basically awareness again. How to know or freeze the amount if a person or unit acts on behalf of a sanctioned person. So, you know, the first point of contact is not obviously a sanctioned person.
Yeah, so if you have an account or funds that you have identified is being used or made available indirectly to a sanctioned entity, targeted financial sanctions would apply to that account or to that customer, which means that you need to do exactly the same thing that you would do as if the account was owned by a sanctioned entity. The important thing here is your domestic reporting requirements. There will be a way to resolve this in your domestic legislation, and for you to report the fact that you have identified funds that you believe are being are connected to or indirectly made available to targeted entities and individuals. So I don't want to go into too much detail because it really steers into domestic reporting requirements. So you need to be very, very clear on what you need to do and what you need to report. But the important thing for our purposes is, have you identified that these funds are made indirectly available to sanctioned entities? Then they are also subject to target financial sanctions measures.
So since you mentioned reporting requirements, and I assume you're gonna come back with this answer that you know, it's pretty much up to domestic regulation, there is a question on what kind of reporting requirements each authority should collect from reporting entities.
Exactly, that is established in domestic legislation.
And for private sector institutions who actually froze property, how do they then manage the frozen property? What happens next after it's been frozen?
Well, I mean, the simple answer is that not much happens. You submit a report, you do your domestic reporting requirements, and then nothing really happens. The account is there, the funds are held, but no transactions go in and out of the account, and the account isn't accessed unless there is a specific authorization or exemption that has been provided by the government or by the United Nations. So the really boring answer is managing funds is basically means that nothing really happens. But again, there will be domestic requirements that set out specifically how entities in Cambodia will be expected to manage this. I will point out that a challenge has been with some of the more physical assets. So this is about assets in a bank account. When it comes to property, when it comes to vessels, how do you manage a giant oil tanker who is sat in a port? And I would say at that point, definitely defer to your national authorities, because that might require some further instruction and some further help. Sorry, I can't go into more specifics on that specific question.
Okay. There are further questions from the members of the insurance industry, and I think you wanted to address those. So the first of those, and I'm going to group them, I think, two. For insurance company, could you please explain in detail or raise a few points how the insurance company should perceive CPF in general? And also there was a further request on some more examples of you know, in the insurance industry dealing with CPF and cases.
Yeah, so the good news to the last question is that we have actually written a whole report on the insurance industry and proliferation financing. So perhaps we can include a link to that report in the email that we send out to all participants after this training. But I can also provide a few insights from the report now. What we found is that insurers are mostly exposed in the maritime domain to the provision of insurance for vessels that engage in sanctioned activity or are designated vessels, or vessels that are connected to sanctioned entities and individuals. So if an insurance policy is taken out on that vessel, either on the hull of the vessel, on the crew on the vessel, third-party liability, for example, or the cargo that is transported on the vessel, sometimes that is 3 different insurance policies. But all of those insurance policies would in some way to be connected to the owner, if the owner of the vessel is a sanctioned party, that causes some exposure to the insurance company, and the insurance company is providing a financial service to a sanctioned party in that case. So just like, to answer the first question, just like a bank would at onboarding screen for any details of a customer that overlaps or has a match with the UN sanctions lists, insurance companies would do exactly the same. Prior to joining RUSI, I worked in a insurance company in London, specifically on maritime insurance. And what we would do when a new risk came in, and when a new ship was about to be insured, you would run the ownership details, you would run the any details of people who have an interest or involvement in the vessel. You would run that through a sanction screening tool. We would also ask additional questions about whether the vessel was operating in certain waters. So if it was going close to sanctioned countries, we considered that a sanctions risk. If it involved or was expected to ship certain goods that might be sanctioned. So for example, proliferation sensitive goods, or certain goods that has a sanctions exposure. So the same questions that a bank would ask, and the same procedure that a bank would ask at the point of onboarding would also be done by an insurance company. Now, the transaction monitoring aspect is a little bit different, because an insurance policy often runs for a year. And during that year, the insurance company might have limited interaction with the with the insured party. So unless there's a claim on the insurance policy, the insurance company might not know what the party's up to, because there's not regular incoming and outgoing transactions. There's not activity on an account in the same way that there is for a bank. So what many insurance companies do is that they have a sanctions clause. They put in place a sanctions clause that says if you are involved in any sanctionable activities, or if you become sanctioned, then this insurance policy is void. Then this insurance policy no longer works. However, that only gets you so far, because it essentially means that unless there is a claim, you might not find out if the sanctioned party becomes subject to sanctions. But it is important that every time there's an update to a sanctions list, every time there's a change to a sanctions list, or someone new is added to a sanctions list, that you run those changes through all existing policies in order to detect whether any parties that you are currently insuring are now subject to sanctions or are connected to sanctions. And if that's the case, then your sanctions clause would then kick in. Recently, some insurance companies, because of the heightened risk of vessels being involved in sanctions evasion and involved in proliferation financing and being designated, recently some insurance companies have taken steps to actually live monitoring the vessels that they're insuring. So vessels have an IMO number that is specific to that vessel, and some insurance companies have acquired programs that monitors the movements of those ships in order to detect whether they're going into sanctioned territories, for example. That is something that the UN Security Council is looking at recommending, but it's an additional step that you might take in order to safeguard yourself against sanctions risk, because you don't have that same view on an account basis like a bank would do. So hopefully that clarifies a bit, but we will send you the full report that details all of this in practice, and also has a few case studies that shows instances of where insurance companies have been involved with sanctioned entities. Thank
you. Thanks, Emil. A couple of questions on basically, again, UN recommendations, regulations, and actually the countries that are earmarked for CPF. One question is, if we're using the appropriate screening, sanction screening providers like WorkCheck, Dow Jones, Watchlist, and so on, do we still have to actually monitor the UN sanctions list for further confirmation? And I think that's going to be a short answer from you. Also, we now know that Iran and DPRK are flagged as proliferators, but can they be removed in the future? Can any other countries be added?
Yeah, so the first question, if you are employing the services of a sanction screening provider, such as WorldCheck or Dow Jones or LexisNexis, and so on, well, I mean, I can't promise, right? But in theory, those providers should import the UN list as soon as it is adopted into the screening software. So yes, you should be fine, and there shouldn't be a need for you for yourself to go and consult UN lists on top of that. The only thing I will say is something my boss Tom Keating keeps saying, has said to me for many years, is who checks WorldCheck? Who actually makes sure that WorldCheck has imported the right list at the right time, so that the lists are featured in your transaction monitoring from the moment that they're adopted? You're probably safe, you're probably good, but just a caveat that of course there's no one actually checking WorldCheck to make sure that happens. But they are big companies, so I'm sure it's all good. The second question was about, sorry, remind me of that, Wojtek.
So Iran and the DPRK are recognized proliferators, and what can happen in the future? Can they be removed? Can other countries be added?
Yeah, really, really good question. So this is why I think it's important for any financial institution, any private sector company that implements sanctions to future-proof their sanctions compliance regime, so that it is not just relevant to the proliferators that have currently been identified by the United Nations, but is also future-proof for future regimes that might show up on the list. And actually, steps like having proper sanction screening measures, steps like being aware of sanctions evasion techniques, steps like conducting a risk assessment. Maybe that risk assessment doesn't just look at specific actors, it actually looks at activities. So it looks at the involvement of dual-use goods sectors that are shipping to any country rather than just the two specified countries. Or it involves chemical industries. It's not just all about nuclear weapons, there's also chemical weapons. You can do things to future-proof your compliance regime to make sure that if the United Nations decides that sanctions are warranted for other proliferating actors and sanctions come into place, that you are ready to implement those sanctions, that you already have an awareness of that risk. I will say that in an ideal world, no actor, no place, anywhere at any point at any time should be able to develop nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. And I think most people would agree with that. So independently of the specific sanctions that are in place, I would hope that private sector entities around the world would be aware of any illicit activities that are going on connected to the procurement, development, acquisition, transport, sale of nuclear, chemical, biological weapons, or the materials that are connected and go into those programs. I would hope that private sector entities would still pay attention to that outside of the implementation of the specific targeted financial sanctions.
Thanks, Emil. Some questions regarding the sanctions screening system. There's a question about the travel ban. So if the travel ban is applied to an individual, does this extend to his immediate family as well?
I can't answer that question. That's something that will be probably defined in domestic law. What I will say, it comes down to this definition of whether someone is acting on behalf of a sanctioned entity. If someone is a close family member of a sanctioned entity, it is certainly worth looking into whether that close family member might be conducting business on behalf of the sanctioned entity and might be used as a way for the sanctioned entity to circumvent sanctions. So that's all I'll say, but specific requirements like that, I won't be able to comment on, because I don't want to say anything that then is not the case in Cambodia or in your domestic legislation.
The further question on such details is about the basic expense, which is the normal transaction for customers. Is that accepted for monitoring, or should be taken into account as well when it comes to CPA?
Yeah. So in the nicest way possible, it is not up to you as a private sector actor to define whether something is a basic expense or is a small transaction. A basic expense is something that is authorized by the national government, sometimes with input and license from provided by the UN. And you should only be allowing those transactions to go through if you have a specific license in hand that certifies that that transaction can go through. So that's all I'll say. It's not up to the private sector entity to define whether something is a basic living expense or not. That's the regulator.
And is it possible to provide or receive payment from a sanctioned entity after providing a hotel?
That's a great question. And I would like to tell a little story. So I think you probably all remember the US DPRK summits that took place in Singapore and in Hanoi. And to those, on those trips from the DPRK delegation were some individuals who were subject to sanctions, and some of the activities involved would have been subject to sanctions, such as flying them and putting them up in hotels in Singapore. And actually, in that instance, a license had to be sought from the United Nations in order to exempt from that activity. So things like providing a hotel room stay to a sanctioned entity, or receiving payment from a sanctioned entity after providing a hotel room service or a stay in a hotel, would probably classify something like an exceptional expense that would need to be approved and have a license for. I wouldn't say it's a basic expense unless they absolutely need to stay in that hotel room service. But again, you can't receive that payment or provide that service unless you have a license to do so.
I see an interesting question in the chat box. Could you detail any criteria to define customer risk profile as low, high, medium? And I think you can perhaps reference a national risk assessment.
Yeah, I can, but I would like to say that what we're talking about in today's training, the implementation of targeted financial sanctions, is very rules-based. So it's a rule that says you need to implement targeted financial sanctions. We've talked about targeted financial sanctions covering other entities, individuals that are connected to designated parties. And we've talked about sanctions evasion mechanisms, and we talked about ways to detect sanctions evasion mechanisms. So I think in that context, defining customers as high, medium, and low when you're talking about a rules-based area is not possible for the following reason. So because there's no threshold for when sanction screening must be done, no customer will ever be defined as low risk for sanctions, because the basic level of sanction screening will have to be carried out no matter the perceived level of risk for a certain transaction or a customer. That being said, you're absolutely right that some situations might indicate higher risk of sanctions evasion, or might indicate that sanctions evasion is taking place, or certain sectors might be more exposed to sanctions evasion related to proliferation, or might be more exposed to the involvement of sanctioned entities. An example of that is the dual-use goods sector. Because we know that proliferators and sanctioned entities are seeking these specific goods, the dual-use goods sector, the high-tech manufacturing sector, is perhaps a particular exposure to sanctions evasion. So might warrant further due diligence. Other sectors, so say you have a particularly large shipping sector in your country, and we know that most things are being shipped to and from a sanctioned country by ship, then that might be a sector that is particularly exposed and might be higher risk. So outside of the rules-based approach, There are also other, I refer to other sanctions on sanctioned entities. I refer to sectoral sanctions and activity-based sanctions. And here it's much more of a risk-based approach. And here you can conduct a risk assessment. I wouldn't say conduct yeah, if that makes sense. So here you will look at certain activities that, that you are providing. So say you have particularly large portfolio of clients that includes insurance companies, and you know those insurance companies are prohibited from insuring certain activities and things like that, then that is a group of clients that you might classify as high risk. If you have clients who have a particular trade in a part of the world that or in a neighboring country to a sanctioned entity, you might classify that group of clients that operate in that area of the world as higher risk. Low risk could be a client that only operates domestically and has no international transactions, have no kind of touch points with proliferation financing typologies. But from a sanctions perspective, there is no such thing as low risk. So I hope that makes sense. We will shortly be releasing a paper at RUSI looking at risk-based approaches to CPF compliance. But I would like to reiterate that that is not required by the FATF. The FATF is only focused on the implementation of targeted financial sanctions, and in that aspect, sanctions apply whether it is low or high risk needs to be screened regardless. Hopefully that I could go on for ages about how to define risk low, medium, high, but we can send through some resources on that as well.
Thank you, Emil. That was truly a large volley of questions out there, and I think you've done a tremendous job at answering a lot of those and addressing very different areas of what we covered today. I see we still have further questions in the Q&A box. I do believe we have partially replied to some of the issues raised, and if not, we will be sending supplementary materials following the event, as we are now almost at the end of our time. I just wanted you to answer this question, which is a nice wrapper on the entire section. Which system is the best for customer screening, according to you?
I think I'm going to take the BBC approach on that one. So the BBC is the national broadcasting channel here in the UK. And they have a rule that during a BBC program, you're not allowed to endorse a specific product or a specific service. So I'm going to take the BBC line here and say I will not endorse or support a specific service. There is a question here about true match and false hit. Can I address that one, Wojciech?
Of course.
There's a question here about if you're able to confirm this. So this is where your domestic reporting requirements become really crucial. So I of course don't know what the mechanism is and will be in Cambodia, but some countries will have a hotline for resolving for sanctions inquiries where things like this can be submitted for resolving potential false positives or confirming. But again, I would encourage you to keep digging into the information that's provided by the United Nations sanctions committees that might help you identify whether the person in question is the sanctioned person or whether it's just someone who has a very similar name or very similar characteristics. There is a problem with actually asking the client themselves if they are the ones involved, because that would involve typically